All right, it's 12:01, so I would like for us to get started. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Lauren Gunn-Sandell, and I am a research scientist with the Center for Innovative Design and Analysis with the Colorado School of Public Health. Thank you so much for attending and participating in this year's CU Data Week. We have sessions over the next week at noon every day, and for each Friday, both tomorrow, the 7th, and Friday, the 14th, we are also offering a live office hours for you to attend if you have any questions regarding the material that has been covered over the 2 weeks of content, or if you have issues with the code and programming that we've been presenting. So I'm going to put a link in the chat if you would be interested in registering for more of our seminars or for the Friday office hours. I'll put that in the chat right now. This also is simply a link to our website. So if you find our website on the School of Public Health page, then you can scroll down past the courses and there's a registration button for you. And also, I just want to remind you that we are conducting a raffle. So please stay until the end of our seminar today, and I will share the attendance survey. We have taken the feedback from previous years and incorporated that into our content for the last couple of years. So we really do listen to your feedback and suggestions in that post-attendance survey. And additionally, for every seminar survey that you complete, you are added to our raffle to win a $75 gift card. If you need access to the CU Dropbox with all of the seminar's content, I will also share that in the chat right now for you. And you should be able to access any script files, data files, and PowerPoint presentations that are being shared throughout the week's content. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker today. This is Rachel Johnson, and she is going to be presenting on how to meet with a statistician. So I'll hand it over to you, Rachel.
All right, thank you, Lauren. I am going to go ahead and pull up my presentation and share my screen. So just one moment on that. All right. Lovely. And it looks like I should be able to begin here. Is this showing up okay on your end, Lauren? Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I just want to reiterate what Lauren said. Thank you all for being here today and joining in on CU Data Week. I am excited to talk to you today about tips for working with a statistician. And as Lauren said, there are ways that you can contact us through that QR code if you'd like to register for additional CU Data Week sessions. And with that, we can go ahead and hop in and get started today. So a little bit of an overview of my goals to discuss with you today are on the agenda here. So I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about the different models of statistical support within CIDA, which is our Center for Innovative Design and Analysis, and to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of language we're using around these models of statistical support. And then really getting more into the heart of the discussion about when and how to include a statistician in your research team, in addition to how to actually find a statistician and then prepare for that initial meeting. So I have been working at CIDA here. I'm now a senior research instructor and have been here since, I believe, 2016 in different capacities. And during that time, I have worked extensively with our consulting center. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later. But it is an area where we have lots of new incoming projects and get to meet collaborators all across campus. And I have also been a member of the Cube, which again, I'll talk about a little more later, but it's our campus-wide resource for biostatistics, where we have a single intake form that anybody can fill out if they're looking for statistical support. So I'm one of the triage members for that. So that's a little bit of my background and why I'm able to talk today about how to meet with a statistician. So we can go ahead and hop into the first section here. But first, we wanted to do a quick poll to see who is in the audience today. So if you wouldn't mind putting either your department or concentration or your role on campus, whether you're a student, clinical faculty, or trainee, just so that we can get a good sense of who all is in the room today. And while folks are sending that in, I will say that Lauren is here in many capacities for Data Week, but is also helping moderate the chat since I'm not able to see that while I'm presenting. So if you have any questions that come up throughout my talk, please feel free to send those into the chat and Lauren can mention those to me. And if not, we should have some time that's left over at the end for any questions. All right, so folks can continue sending on those affiliations or roles on campus to the chat just to see who all is in the room. All right, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about the different models of statistical support. Starting with two terminologies that you'll see come up very frequently when you might be working with a statistician. And speaking of terminologies, I should first say that we use the term statistician, but that broadly covers biostatisticians, data analysts, bioinformaticians, or data scientists, all within this umbrella. So we all do very similar consulting and collaboration work on campus, even though the actual data or research areas that we're working on might differ. So first, to discuss consulting versus collaboration, we often use the term consulting to refer to a very short-term project. So this could be something as simple as a free 1-hour consultation where you come in to ask a statistician some questions about an analysis that you're running, a poster you're putting together, some study design, or it could be a paid scope of work project where you have an idea for a project and are able to collect that data, but you need a statistician to support some of that study design or data analysis. So usually these consulting projects have that fixed amount of work and very well-defined scopes and very well-defined endpoints. So like I said, we'll have projects similar to this come through CETA's Consulting Center where people need feedback on study design or have a small research project, potentially if you are a graduate student on campus, or maybe doing some QA or QI style work within your department or field. The drawback of this type of project, though, is that the consultant that you're working with as a statistician may not be invested or involved through the entire length of the project. So on the other hand, projects where statisticians are involved through the length of the entire project are typically what we would refer to as collaborations. So in these examples, statisticians would be involved with you or a research team from the grant development stage all the way to the dissemination of the study findings, or perhaps if it is not a grant-funded project, potentially a project where the statistician is involved from analysis planning with you to that final write-up stage. So at its best, we think that a collaboration can be a really mutually beneficial relationship. So we understand that not every project necessarily makes sense to be a collaborative project, either in terms of the scope or the budget, but we really want to emphasize that we think this can be a great way to produce team science on our campus. So having a statistician involved throughout the course of your entire project really integrates them into the team. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that might be beneficial in other cases throughout the presentation. So another quick poll, if folks are willing to share in the chat about their previous experience so far working with a statistician. So have you consulted with a statistician? So those shorter term projects that have kind of a limited scope, or have you collaborated, or both, or neither one of these? It's great to see everybody's affiliations from before. Thank you for sharing those. And all right, great. It's cool to see that we have some folks on the call who have collaborated with a statistician and other chats coming in there. So yeah, feel free to continue sending those in. And hopefully the rest of this discussion will be applicable regardless of your past interactions with a statistician. So whether you're already collaborating with a statistician and really want to improve that team science relationship, or maybe you haven't ever worked with a statistician before, we'll also talk about some of the first steps that you can take to making that a great research relationship. All right, so now that we've kind of developed a common language to talk about this, let's talk about how and when you might want to actually include a statistician in your research team. So this quote here is from the American Statistical Association, and I really like that it focuses on statisticians as people who are really focused on solving research problems. So as statisticians, we are all really excited to guide you to the best way to obtain answers for your research questions. And I think that's really a lot of the focus of our work is in that exciting collaboration of figuring out how do we go from these big picture questions into tangible quantitative results that we can interpret. So why might you actually need a statistician in your project? There are a variety of reasons here that have all come from previous consulting or collaboration projects within CETA. So if you think about your own research, if you need help designing a study to answer your research question, a statistician can be a great resource. And designing a study might be a fairly vague term, but it can encompass a lot. We can help work with you on refining your aims, research questions, and hypotheses, help you determine what variables from electronic health records data that you'll need to pull to answer your research question. On the next line, you see about how many subjects or samples you need. So we commonly perform power and sample size analyses to help people figure that out. Maybe you're also have some background in statistics, but you haven't necessarily taken a class in some of these more specialized methods. So maybe you've learned how to run linear regressions, but you haven't worked with repeated measures longitudinal data or something like survival analysis, which might be very common in some fields, but not common in others. We also have a lot of statisticians within CETA and across campus who have specializations within the fields of omics, so things like genomics, metabolomics, transcriptomics, or imaging, which may require specialized statistical methods, but also require a lot of expertise in terms of computational skills and pre-processing for those data sets. So those could all be great reasons to work with a statistician. Similarly to those big data and computational questions, if you have a volume of data, like electronic health records data, that you may not be able to handle on your own, this is a great situation to reach out to a statistician and see what that process might look like. So data management, as our data in the world gets bigger and bigger, is a really important factor that statisticians are familiar working with. And then in general, if you just want to use the latest methods for design or analysis, or improve the rigor and reproducibility of your research, all of these are potential reasons why you might want to work with a statistician. So across all of these different reasons, at what time point should a statistician actually be involved in your project? So first, we've talked about these free 1-hour consultations. So these are something that we offer at CETA, and they are free to anyone across our campus, where at any point in your project, you can meet with a statistician to discuss the structure of your project, data collection, and any issues you might be having. And pretty commonly, people will come to ask about analysis techniques or interpretation of those results. So in this situation, the statistician can be involved at any point in the project, whether that's your project planning, or maybe you're trying to put together a poster to present at a conference. So in this situation, you don't necessarily need to plan ahead to work with a statistician, although it may help set up future parts of your project to run a little bit more smoothly. There are a few situations, though, where you want to think ahead about when a statistician should be involved. So for those consulting projects that I mentioned, where maybe you need help on a study design, or you have a limited scope project where you'd like a biostatistician or a data scientist to work with your research team, we generally recommend that early is better. So that will be a theme that runs through a few of these different types of projects. So if you work with a statistician on the earlier side, we can help discuss the appropriate timelines, make sure the data collection makes sense, and then if it's not quite time for a statistician to be involved with the analysis, we can at least give a budget or a timeline estimate. And then on the collaboration side, statisticians are typically involved in an ongoing sense. So if you're interested in a more involved project, or maybe you're working on grant funding, working with a statistician in these situations, you would want them to be involved from the start of the process. And then speaking of that grant-supported research, there are kind of two prongs here. The first is when you are actually trying to develop that grant and submit it to a funding agency. In that situation at CETA, we require 60 days before the grant deadline for the statistician to actually be involved in that grant development. If not, we are just not able to work in depth enough with the team to really make sure those aims, hypotheses, and the statistical analysis plan are all aligned. So anything less than 60 days, we worry that our statisticians really won't be able to put in that high quality work to make it really read like a well-flowing, well put together grant. And then once that grant is actually funded, for example, if you're working on a 5-year grant, we would recommend that the statistician has at least some amount of FTE on that grant throughout the entire grant period. So some people are curious about that, and they typically think about statisticians working maybe in years 4 and 5 of a grant period. And we think that that really limits the amount of teamwork and collaboration that a statistician is actually involved in on a project. So this is a 5-year plan from a sample grant showing what a biostatistician did through years 1 through 5 of this entire project. So as you can see, years 4 and 5 have data analysis again and manuscript preparation. And these are definitely really important roles for a statistician, and they typically do require higher percentage FTE to support this work. But all of this work is made possible in years 4 and 5 by the work that was done through the statistical team as a part of the research team in years 1 through 3. So to make the data analysis flow as smoothly as possible and to be able to happen reproducibly, we really recommend that you have a statistician involved if you are creating a database. So if you're setting up a REDCap or something similar, having a statistician on your team make sure you're collecting variables correctly, that maybe surveys or longitudinal projects are set up accurately. A statistician can also obviously do the randomization, but then can also help create test randomizations, again within REDCap, so that your research team may be able to test out branching logic and make sure the randomization works appropriately. And during these early years, statisticians are also working on SAP or statistical analysis plan development. So during this time, we take the overviews of analysis plans that we may have written up in the grant, and we really flesh those out into more detailed products so that we know exactly what methods we're using, if we need to develop any new programs or have trainings in certain softwares, we have time to do that. And then we have really detailed plans for how we're going to work with covariates or look at missing data issues. So these statistical analysis plans are important both in creating that reproducible work, but also in easily setting up for a data analysis and flowing right into a statistical methods section for the manuscript. Other administrative things that might be really important during this time are reporting both to the DSMB and to funding agencies, as well as responding to requests from those agencies. So this is something that a statistician is usually very heavily involved in. We also see database monitoring and data management. So once those statistical analysis plans are developed, statisticians with early sets of data can start working on data cleaning and data management so that once data sets are finalized, they can more easily work on data analysis. So that once that data set is closed at the end of recruitment, a statistician can easily transition into coding that analysis. So this was a lot of detail here, but I do think it's important to discuss that having a statistician involved in your team and attending these project meetings throughout the course of your grant has been so helpful in my previous work and other statisticians at CETA, especially as it comes up with troubleshooting issues around data collection, dealing with these funder responses in terms of either adding new data collection or new tables of information to report. And then also on potentially a more exciting side, being able to support those conference abstracts, presentations, and posters so that you are being able to disseminate this information throughout the course of a grant period. We did ask a couple of biostatisticians, as you can see from all of these responses here, about their ideal collaboration. And as you can see both from the previous page about statisticians being involved throughout the grant and these responses from biostatisticians, you can see two of the biggest terms here are about being included in the team, particularly from the beginning. So you can see that this really matters on the statistician side. And we've also seen in terms of long-term collaborations that this is really how team science is built up over time. So that the clinicians and the medical members of the team are able to understand more about what's happening on the statistics side, and the statisticians are gaining more information and improving their expertise on the research topic. So we think over time, these collaborations where statisticians are involved as members of the full research team have great success in submitting future grants and publications and being able to prove that they really have had team science as they're moving forward into new research. So another topic that often comes up in the realm of collaboration and how to involve a statistician is about authorship. So as you can see here, CETA follows the ICMJE policy, where any biostatistician who is conducting analysis or otherwise making a significant contribution will be a co-author on the publication. So as you can see here, this really helps to acknowledge their intellectual contribution. And it's the same standard that we would hold for all members of the team. Anybody making an intellectual contribution to a publication would be included as a co-author. But where exactly would a statistician go in the author order is the second question that often comes up on this front. So first, I would say if you're working with a statistician already, this is a great conversation to have with them, because where they may need to be in the author order for their career development and goals may be slightly different from where you need to be in the author order. And it's something that can often be worked out really well as a team, and especially if it's discussed beforehand. But in general, these are kind of some frameworks for what we might consider for different authorship roles. So there are some situations where a biostatistician would be the first author. Even though this is first in my list, it is probably not the most common of these roles. But a biostatistician to be the first author would be conducting the analysis, writing a large portion of the manuscript, and would be playing a major role in project development or substantially changing the direction of a hypothesis. So some first author publications that I know from other biostatisticians are looking at how to apply new methods or comparisons of different methods, or perhaps writing up statistical guidelines for an audience within a clinical field about how to analyze certain types of data. So biostatisticians typically aren't first authors on the primary aims of a manuscript, although it does happen occasionally. But it would be more about a paper that has a mix of clinical and statistical work. A second author publication for a biostatistician, though, is often really important, especially to someone like me, who is a master's level statistician and isn't a PhD or on a tenure track. I don't do a lot of methodological research. So for me, being a second author is very similar to actually being a first author in other fields. So in this setup, the biostatistician would be playing a major role in project development, conducting the analysis, and would be involved with that whole life cycle of the project. So I wouldn't necessarily be the second author on every paper where I'm the analyst, but if it's a really substantial amount of complex analysis, this is something where a biostatistician might be the second author. So again, this is something that can really be discussed within your team, depending on how many papers you're writing together, what the different goals of each paper are or what journal you're submitting to. But I think second authorship is something that isn't always realized outside of the field of statistics, how important that can be to a statistician's career growth. And then a middle listed author for a statistician is fairly typical when they are conducting the analysis, writing the statistical methods section, and helping with the interpretation for the manuscript, but not necessarily involved in the entire project, or potentially it's not a very complex or unique analysis method. And then the senior author would come up for a statistician, which in our field at least, senior author would be the last author on a paper, where the biostatistician is playing a significant mentoring role to the first author, offering guidance, and/or playing a major role in helping design the study. So the last situation that sometimes comes up is if you're working with a team of statisticians. So often if you have a junior biostatistician or a student who's being mentored by a senior statistician, we would typically recommend having that junior statistician in the authorship order and then the senior statistician directly after them to be able to show that mentorship role. So again, none of this is a formal definition or protocol for how authorship would work in any statistical collaboration, but this is kind of brought together of all of our statisticians' experience on campus in terms of what's worked well in their research and what research teams have found really show that intellectual contribution. And then a question that sometimes comes up in the world of consultation is if you attended a free consultation for advice from a statistician, should they be an author on your manuscript? And if you wouldn't mind sending in your thoughts to the poll, whether that's yes, no, or I don't know, any of those would be great. So I'm seeing one response of a maybe and some non-responses, which I'm also taking as a maybe or a not sure and a probably not there. So I would agree that in many situations, the answer is probably not. Occasionally this may come up if you attend multiple consultations with a statistician and you both agree that that makes sense. But generally from a statistician's role, if we are an author on a publication, we are saying from our side that we have done all of the analyses or we can stand by all of the statistical results. And that's also what we would think the audience is assuming. So if they had questions about a publication, reached out to the corresponding author and had statistical questions, that it would be passed on to somebody who's listed as a statistician on the manuscript. So we don't want to take credit for statistical analysis work that we didn't do. And we think in that sense, we have not earned being an author. So we haven't necessarily made the intellectual contribution. And as you can see from most of the separate slides before where we were talking about authorship, we typically have to do the analysis to be an author. So I would agree that being an author in this situation usually does not make sense. Occasionally, biostatisticians will be added to the acknowledgements if people are particularly interested in including them on the paper. But for free 1-hour consultations, this is really not something that's expected. So typically, we would be conducting the analysis or mentoring in a significant way to be included as an author on the paper. All right, so that is the conclusion of when and how to include a statistician in your research team. So thinking about the different research projects you may be working on, I think it's interesting to think about which ones a statistician might make sense to work on. And then if you're thinking about, okay, great, they might be really helpful to work with on this project, how do you actually find that statistician? So some things to think about while you are looking for a statistician are recommended again by the American Statistical Association here. And I would almost put strong communication as our top bullet point here. So even though I arranged this presentation slide, the more you think about it, the more that strong communication is a really important part of our role. So many people think about statisticians coding, typing up a lot, working pretty independently and then sending results to people. But in this team science environment on the Anschutz campus, a huge part of our role day to day is communication. So whether that is written communication, just in terms of day-to-day emails, or in terms of abstract statistical methods and results sections, along with that oral communication, these are skills that play a huge portion of our role here. So a lot of that oral communication is working in meetings and being able to explain these statistical concepts to team members or to an audience that we're planning on for a conference or for a journal. So some of that is being able to discuss these statistical concepts. So taking the statistical concepts and translating those into clinical or research findings. But statisticians that you work with should also be a good listener. So they should be working with your clinical or research questions and trying to determine how exactly does that fit within the statistical methods. So making sure that all team members are aligned on research questions and hypotheses and how to actually analyze those is a really important part of our job. So in addition to that, a good knowledge of statistics and being up to date with current literature is really important, but it can be a little bit trickier to analyze if you're not a statistician, whether the person that you're working with has a good working knowledge. But luckily, as a member of CETA and working with other statistical cores on our campus, I can at least vouch and say that our campus is really strong in this front. We have really collaborative statisticians who work to stay updated in the field and also work with one another. So learning from other people's expertise, presenting on current projects, having seminars to improve our methods skills. I think this is kind of a given in a great way that so many of our statisticians have a really good base knowledge and continue to improve that over time. And then again, working with a statistician is a research relationship. So you want to make sure that they are responsive, they're meeting deadlines, and that you have shared goals together, as well as being able to respect research ethics. I think all of these are really important things to look for while you're looking for a statistician. So I've mentioned that I think statisticians within CETA and across campus have great skills on this front. How do you actually find one of them to work with? So you can start out by, if you have a statistician in your department, reaching out to them if you have a process set up or just directly to that statistician. But unfortunately, not every department has a statistician working with them, or it doesn't always make sense for a department to have a statistician embedded within that. But your collaborator or mentor may also have a statistician they are working with. And then finally, we have 4 different groups on campus with many statisticians. And as you can see from the names here, they specialize or generalize in a variety of research topics. So obviously from the logo here, I am within CETA, but we also work closely with statisticians in all of these different groups on campus, whether it's pediatric health with the Children's Hospital Biostatistics Core, with different trials, or with adult and child outcomes in accords, or with cancer-related research in the Cancer Center BBSR. So regardless of which of these statisticians you're looking for, we do want to note that like all other professionals on campus, statisticians do not work for free. So be prepared to discuss a budget when you go into these meetings. So we have those 4 groups that I mentioned here, but how do you determine which of those 4 groups you should actually work with on your upcoming research? And this is where the cube that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation comes into play. So this is a newer group on campus within the past year, and it is a joint effort of those 4 biostatistics and bioinformatics cores that I mentioned. So that's Accords, BBSR, which is the Cancer Center, CHBC, which is Children's Hospital, and CETA, which is embedded within the School of Public Health, but works with research groups all across campus. So part of the purpose of the cube is to let us help figure out which core is the best fit for your project. So we have a QR code and a website here at the bottom, or you can just look up the cube on the CU Anschutz campus if you're interested in this. So we can help you figure out which core is the best fit for your project based on the subject matter, the statistical expertise within these groups, and we can also check that these groups will have a confirmed availability to work with you. So let's say that you are interested in this or may want to keep this in mind for a future project. If you go to the CUBE website, you can click to connect with your biostatistics and bioinformatics navigator, and that will take you to that single intake form that I mentioned. So I'll just walk you through a couple of the questions that we ask in this form, just so you can be thinking about them in the meantime. And the first one of those is if you are trying to connect with any of the following groups. And if you already have a relationship set up with a statistician in Accords, or your mentor is a member of the Cancer Center and you've worked with them on a project before, you can go ahead and select that group at the beginning, and then the CUBE team will triage it out to that appropriate team. And you can also give a little bit more context here on any existing relationships that you have with an analyst. So you could say, oh, I'm trying to connect with CETA. I worked with Lauren Gunn Sandell on some 1-hour consults, and I'd really like to work with her on an upcoming project if she has availability. Or if you have worked with a statistician in the past, or really any other context that you can give here will help the CUBE team triage this out to the appropriate group. So this is just the first introduction to that form. And in addition to seeing if we have any existing relationships with you, we just want to get a little bit of information about your project goals. So if you just want that free 1-hour consultation where you ask some questions, get some advice on your project, that's super easy, just the first option. And then we get into a little bit more detail about maybe you're trying to develop a grant, or you're interested in manuscript or abstract submissions, pardon me. We have options for all of these here, as well as another field, if you don't feel that any of these encapsulate exactly the sort of statistical support you're looking for. And then here we just have a couple fields to get a little bit of information on that project. So like I mentioned, we're interested in making sure that we have the statistical and research area expertise on our teams before we would triage that project out to a specific statistical core. So again, this can be brief here. We're just trying to get a little bit of information. And then that's pretty much all we need, just a couple of questions to make sure that we are tracking this appropriately and make sure that if there's an existing relationship, it goes to the correct group. So let's say you go to this website, submit your form, and your request is triaged to CETA. What would be the next steps? So if you're just looking for that free 1-hour consultation, it's super simple. You would receive an email then that would give you a calendar sign up with a list of the statisticians who are available at specific times, as well as a little bit of information on their general areas of expertise. But on the other hand, if you are looking for a consulting project or a collaboration, so maybe if you were interested in a manuscript or abstract submission to a conference, or that long-term collaboration, you would either get a link to sign up for a scope of work meeting for that consulting project, or an intake meeting with an admin team member on CETA. And then we'd be able to meet with you individually to discuss those project details. So any statistical support needs you have, budgets and deadlines, and making sure we understand the general scope of your project. So there are 4 different groups within the CUBE. They don't all work identically, but we have overall similar processes for how it would work depending on which statistical core your project makes the most sense with. And just as a reminder, as you are looking for a statistician, this really is a research relationship. So making sure that your expectations on communication, behavior, funding, and authorship are all aligned is really important for you and for the statistician. So if this isn't working out with your current statistician, we think it's really important to talk to them and make sure that both team members understand this. And it doesn't necessarily have to be anything scandalous or bad going on here. It could just be that you have a great time working with this statistician and the research is so interesting, but they only have 5% of their effort available for this year. So that would just be an example of funding not necessarily aligning in this sense. So we have these multiple statistical cores on campus, lots of statistical and research expertise all around campus. So sadly, if these relationships aren't aligning, we do have other great options where hopefully you can find a statistician that really works well within your research team. So at this point, we've talked about when and how you might want to include a statistician in your research team, and then how to actually find that statistician. So now we're at the point where maybe you've entered information into the cube form because you've planned ahead. You have a meeting set up with that statistician. How do you actually prepare for that meeting, and what should you bring? So the first type of meeting I will talk about is if you are looking for study design or grant development support. And I'll have a few different items here that aren't necessarily applicable to every project, or potentially you may just not have these ready at a certain point, and that's totally okay. But I would say the most important one that you can bring is a set of proposed aims or your current research questions and hypotheses. Even if these are in super, super rough draft form, that is totally okay. It's just to get everybody working on the same page from the beginning. So after that, if you have any important ideas that can really be graphed or drawn out, diagrammed, whether you're working with cell biology and have some physical diagrams of what's going on that you want to draw out, or if you are interested in the health belief model and want to bring the path diagram for that. Anything to get your statistician oriented to your general clinical and research interests is a great way to start. Similar to those proposed aims and research questions, any information that you have about the outcomes you're interested in would be great. As well as, and this is kind of a tricky one, we understand on the statistical side, anything about the estimated effect sizes, which we would use for a power and sample size analysis. And we totally understand that in every kickoff meeting, this information won't be ready. But I think it's important to consider that if you don't have this information ready at a kickoff meeting, it's something that we may need to work together to figure out. And then again, a feasible sample size. So obviously the statistician working on this would be interested in a power and sample size analysis if you're submitting a grant. But this is just along the lines of being able to say, for this study, we think we'll be able to afford 10 to 20 mice, or this is going to be a really large observational study. We probably need to collect at least a couple thousand. So again, if you don't know this, your statistician can work with you, but these are really helpful ideas to have to bring. Any proposed timelines that you have, whether that's with regards to actually submitting this grant or the timeline of your study that you're thinking about. And then if you have any relevant literature, so whether it's previous publications, methods that you're currently interested in, those are great to have. And then if you happen to have any preliminary or pilot data that you can share with the statistician, with, of course, no protected health information included in that, these are all different things that could be really helpful to bring to the study design and grant development meeting. And when I say bring, some of it could be emailed to the statistician in advance so they have time to look at it beforehand. Some of it are things that could just be emailed afterwards or screen shared during a meeting. And a couple things that we recommend people keep in mind for this initial kickoff meeting for grant development is to involve all the decision makers in this original meeting. So all the investigators, anybody that's making decisions about the aims, about the grant as a whole, it's really helpful to at least have that team in the first meeting so everyone can be on the same page. And to just be prepared that study design is an iterative process. So it's probably going to include multiple meetings throughout the course of this submission. And this is one of the reasons why we recommend that people come in at least 60 days before the grant deadline, but we do require 60 days at a minimum. And of course, then more time is ideal. So on the other hand, if your project has already been funded or data has already been collected, so you're not working on the study design aspect, we would still recommend, if you have that page of specific aims or your research questions and hypotheses, that you're able to bring those to the meeting, as well as similarly those schematics or diagrams of any important ideas. On this end, it would be helpful for us to have any details about the study design or the data collection schedule. So perhaps if you were doing chart review or data abstraction from those charts, you could tell us the time windows from which you pulled that. Or if it is a data collection schedule, we may be able to get a sense of how many baseline and follow-up visits there were in a trial. Similarly, if you have any information from a grant or from a protocol, these are really helpful starting places. And then relevant literature comes up again here. So if your group has worked and has previous publications in this field or with this data set, those are great starting points for your statistical team. Or if there are example manuscripts where maybe there's something you want to mirror. So if you really liked how a figure was set up in a certain manuscript and think that you're collecting similar data, it is great to be able to bring that to an original meeting and say that this is how you would love to present your results. Of course, if that makes sense for your specific research question. And once again, any deadlines that you have, whether that's related to people's funding on your project, to conferences that are coming up. And something that's really helpful to actually be able to share is the actual data or the database. And once again, we don't want any protected health information shown in this meeting. But if you are able to share the data with your statistician beforehand or screen share during the meeting, this can really help kick off the process. So like I said, for sharing data, there are a couple things that are really helpful to be able to do here. So when you're able to screen share that data during the meeting or give the statistician access beforehand, it really helps speed up the process in terms of us being able to understand the structure of your data and what variables are really important. And of course, I've mentioned it before, but in terms of sharing data, the first important thing to be careful about is thinking about de-identification or PHI. So we don't want to be sharing any of that in meetings if that's in the data and people are not set up with the permissions to be able to do that. So again, thinking about those data access rights needed before sharing. So whether signed agreements are needed, the statistician needs to be added to the IRB, or if the data needs to be requested from somewhere. This data sharing process can actually be one of the toughest things in terms of setting up a project or creating delays in the initial project stages. So being able to think about those data access rights ahead of time are important. At CETA, we recommend the use of REDCap whenever it is possible and makes sense for your project. And just knowing that EHR and Compass data requires really extensive data management and a lot of expertise. So turnaround on these projects will be a lot longer because that data management is really complex. And like I said, being able to share the actual data set as soon as possible is really important for keeping projects on schedule, especially in those initial stages. And then a few things to note about what your data should look like when you're actually sharing it. I will note it's bolded at the bottom, but using REDCap, if it's possible, makes all of this so much smoother when it's time to share the data and prepare for data cleaning and analysis. So you may hear a lot of statisticians say that data is expected to be clean when it's delivered to the statistical team. And this may not be a term that's used all across campus, depending on people's background. So clean data is described here as data that includes informative variable names, has one variable per column and one observation per row, one value per cell, if you're thinking about data in a matrix like you would in an Excel spreadsheet, and then no color coding or bolds and italics to convey meaning. Minimal free text fields are also really helpful. So anything where participants are able to write in full sentences or things that may have spelling mistakes can really add to that data cleaning time. So again, you don't need to sit and think too hard about your data. Is there one value per cell? Is there one observation per row? As long as you have this data set up in a format like REDCap, which does it automatically for you. So there are some situations like with big data or merging data from multiple sites where data management might be part of the scope. But in terms of general projects, when you're working with a statistician, if you are delivering that data to them, that data is expected to be clean. And then finally, in all of these meetings with a statistician, be prepared to discuss, obviously, whatever outcomes you're interested in your data, but especially how they're collected and measured. So is this a validated scale? Are we getting this data from ICD codes in the EHR? Is this something that participants are self-reporting? As well as the different variable types. So whether it's a numeric scale, counts, or categories. Thinking about important potential covariates and then moderators or interaction terms and mediators. So we can make sure we have all of those variables in the data and that we understand their format or their missingness if that comes up. The study timeline and important deadlines. And within that goes the budget conversations that we're able to have. And then finally, what the plans are for dissemination. So if your final goal is to submit a manuscript for this, or you're mentoring people who want to submit abstracts to different conferences, being prepared to discuss all of this so that the statistician can plan ahead and be able to work with your team on all of that is important across all of these different types of projects. So that was a lot of information today, and I hope it has really helped you think about when it makes sense to work with a statistician, how to find one on campus, and how to prepare for those initial meetings. So like Lauren said before, for the folks who have been able to stay, we really appreciate it. And we'll be able to share a link to a survey in the chat. And I've also put my email here if you have any specific follow-up questions for me. But I'm also happy to answer any other questions that folks have in the last few minutes here. So I'll stop sharing my screen at the moment.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I don't see any open questions in the chat. So if anyone has questions and is brave enough to unmute, please feel free.
Yes.
Oh,
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say this session has been recorded. And so in about a week, we will be posting the recording on our CETA website. And that will be on the same page where you can register for more sessions for CU Data Week 2025. So I've put that link in the chat here. And again, if you scroll up to a few more comments above, that's where we have the survey link to enter you into the raffle.
Yes, and I'll just put my email in the chat again. If folks have any additional questions, I'm happy to answer those, whether they're related to CETA or working with the Cube. And I just want to thank you all again for taking time today to join CU Data Week, and I hope that you're able to join in on some of the other really great sessions that are coming up. All right.